Welcome to another episode of True Crime Pulse, where we uncover the unsettling realities behind real-life crimes. In today's episode, we dive into the story of Abigail Myers, a 35-year-old woman who seemed to have it all. Abigail, a successful real estate agent in the picturesque town of Greenfield, was admired for her charm and determination, quickly earning respect within her industry. Yet beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life, there were cracks that few noticed. Abigail wasn't only known for her professional achievements, but also for her warmth and kindness. She was always ready to offer a helping hand or a comforting word. A devoted wife, loving daughter, and active community member, she frequently participated in charity events and social gatherings. To outsiders, her marriage to Trevor Myers appeared solid. Trevor, an architect celebrated for his cutting-edge designs, had been Abigail's high school sweetheart. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, successful, attractive, and deeply in love. For nearly a decade, they lived a life that looked full of love, despite not having children. But as with many picture-perfect relationships, not everything was as it appeared. Over time, the foundation of their marriage began to crumble. Trevor's late nights at the office became routine, and Abigail couldn't help but notice his growing distance. Always optimistic, she attributed it to work stress, never imagining the betrayal happening right under her nose. Meanwhile, Eleanor Bennett, Abigail's 57-year-old mother, had become a central figure in her life, especially after the loss of Abigail's father 5 years ago. As a widow, Eleanor immersed herself in Abigail's world, offering steadfast support and advice. She often stayed at Abigail and Trevor's home during his frequent business trips, keeping her daughter company. But Eleanor harbored a dark secret. Behind her composed, graceful exterior, she struggled with loneliness and unfulfilled desires. Her quiet life as a widow left her yearning for connection, eventually leading her down a dangerous path. Over the past few months, Eleanor had become entangled in a forbidden affair with her son-in-law, Trevor. What began as innocent gestures, comforting touches, lingering glances soon spiraled into something illicit and destructive. The secrecy of their encounters only heightened their passion. They would meet whenever Abigail was out showing houses or running errands, using her absence to fuel their hidden affair. Shockingly, some of their clandestine meetings took place in Abigail and Trevor's own home, taking advantage of the time she was away. Trevor found himself trapped in a whirlwind of temptation and guilt. Although he knew it was wrong, he was drawn to the dangerous allure of his affair with Eleanor. The thrill contrasted sharply with the steady predictability of his marriage to Abigail. Trevor convinced himself that he could juggle both relationships, compartmentalizing his life in a way that seemed manageable at the time. He mastered the art of deception, offering Abigail affection and half-truths while concealing his infidelity. Eleanor, however, felt little internal conflict. She had always been determined to pursue what she wanted, and now she wanted Trevor. She didn't see herself as the villain, but rather as someone acting on her desires. To Eleanor, the affair was a way to recapture her youth and feel alive again. She even found a twisted sense of power over her daughter, relishing the secret. The consequences and potential harm her actions could cause seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Meanwhile, Abigail was blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing in her own family. She continued her life as though everything was perfectly normal, devoted to both her husband and mother, trusting them implicitly. The close bond they shared seemed like a blessing to her, not a threat. For months, she remained focused on her work, charity events, and maintaining her seemingly perfect life, never suspecting the betrayal unfolding right under her nose. But secrets like these rarely stay hidden forever. It was only a matter of time before one small mistake would unravel everything, leading to an inevitable and tragic collapse. When the truth finally surfaced, it would be more devastating than Abigail could have ever imagined. The discovery of her body shocked the entire community. It all began on a quiet Sunday morning when her neighbor, Jasper Connolly, sensed something was amiss. Jasper, who had always enjoyed light-hearted banter with Abigail over their shared garden fence, noticed her car still parked in the driveway and an eerie silence surrounding the house. Initially, he dismissed it, thinking she was simply enjoying a rare day off. But as the hours passed and the stillness persisted, unease began to gnaw at him. Deciding to check on her, Jasper approached the house and saw the front door slightly ajar. He called her name, but there was no response. His anxiety deepened as he cautiously stepped inside. The sight that greeted him was horrifying. Abigail's lifeless body lay on the cold tile floor, her eyes wide open, a pool of blood beneath her head. Jasper froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment he was paralyzed with shock. Then, jolted back to reality, he stumbled out of the house, frantically dialing 911. Within minutes, the once quiet street was filled with the wails of police and ambulances. Crime scene tapes surrounded the house as curious onlookers gathered. Detective Laura Carson, known for her meticulous nature and relentless pursuit of justice, arrived swiftly, followed by her partner, Detective Samuel Ortiz. As they entered the home, the pungent smell of death overwhelmed them, setting the stage for an investigation that would uncover a web of betrayal and deceit. Laura moved cautiously into the kitchen, where Abigail's body lay on the floor. Kneeling beside her, she carefully examined the scene, taking note of the blood spatter, the body's position, and other critical details. Bruises were visible on Abigail's wrists, blood pooled around her head, and shards of broken glass were scattered nearby. Detective Samuel Ortiz scanned the room, observing the overturned furniture and clear signs of a violent struggle, evidence that Abigail had fought fiercely against her attacker. "Whoever did this didn't expect her to fight back," Laura murmured under her breath. Samuel nodded, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a small piece of dark green fabric near the body. He picked it up and held it out for Laura to inspect. "This doesn't belong here," he said, scrutinizing the fabric. "It doesn't match anything she's wearing." Laura took the fabric from him, her mind racing with possibilities. "Bag it. We'll let forensics take a closer look. This could be our first real clue," she said firmly, preparing herself for the deeper layers of the investigation. As the forensic team began their work, Laura and Samuel turned their attention to Jasper, who sat on the front steps, pale and visibly shaken. They approached him carefully, understanding the shock he was in. "Mr. Connolly," Laura began softly, "I'm Detective Carson, and this is Detective Ortiz. We know this is difficult, but we need to ask you a few questions about what you saw this morning." Jasper, still trembling, nodded and took a deep breath. "I just came over to check on her. The door was open. I thought she might be in trouble," he said, his voice faltering. I never expected to find his words trailed off as he stared at his dirt-streaked hands, still shaking. "I've known Abigail for years," Jasper continued, his voice breaking. "She didn't deserve this." Laura gave him a reassuring nod. "We're going to find out what happened, Mr. Connolly. You have our word." Inside, the forensic team uncovered more clues. Along with the torn fabric, they found smudged fingerprints on the kitchen counter and a faint, partially erased footprint near the back door. Samuel's attention was drawn to a broken vase hidden beneath a cabinet, its shattered pieces scattered across the floor. A faint scent of perfume, unfamiliar and floral, lingered in the air, different from Abigail's usual fragrance. As the body was transported for autopsy, Laura and Samuel began piecing together the initial clues. The torn fabric, smudged fingerprints, and unfamiliar scent painted a clearer but unsettling picture of what had taken place. The investigation was just beginning, but it was already clear that Abigail Myers' death was no accident. Questions swirled: who did the green fabric belong to? Whose perfume lingered in the air? And what happened in this once happy home? One thing was certain: Abigail's death had not been random. As Laura and Samuel left the scene that day, they knew they were just starting to unravel the dark secrets hidden within Abigail's seemingly perfect life. The crime scene pointed toward a deeply personal motive. Anger, betrayal, and hidden agendas all seemed to lurk beneath the surface. As they reviewed the evidence, the torn green fabric was sent to the forensic lab, a potential key to unlocking the mystery. Their next step was to speak to those closest to Abigail, starting with her husband, Trevor Myers. When they arrived at the Myers home, Trevor sat on the couch, his eyes red from crying. Despite his apparent grief, something about his behavior struck Laura as off. Years of experience had taught her to spot when a grieving spouse's sorrow was genuine and when it wasn't. His emotions seemed forced, as though he was trying too hard to act the part of the devastated husband. "Mr. Myers," Laura began gently, "we're very sorry for your loss. We understand how difficult this must be, but we need to ask you some questions about Abigail." Trevor dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief, his voice shaky. I can't understand why anyone would want to hurt her." Detective Samuel Ortiz leaned in. "Can you think of anyone who might have had a motive? Any recent disputes or concerns Abigail may have mentioned?" Trevor paused, his brow furrowing. "No, nothing like that. She was loved by everyone," he stammered, his voice trembling. "She was always so kind, always helping others. I can't imagine anyone wanting to harm her." Laura watched as Trevor's hands fidgeted, a sign of growing anxiety. Were there any personal issues she might have been worried about? "Anything unusual?" she asked gently. Trevor hesitated for a moment before shaking his head again. "No, not that I know of," he said, though the lack of conviction in his tone was unmistakable. His answers seemed rehearsed, and as the detectives wrapped up their questioning, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Trevor was hiding something. Her gut told her there was more to the story. When they arrived at Eleanor Bennett's hotel, her calm demeanor surprised them, especially given the tragic circumstances. "Mrs. Bennett, we appreciate you speaking with us," Samuel began, easing into the questions. Eleanor nodded. "Of course. I want to help however I can. Abigail was my only child, and we were very close," she said, her voice steady. Laura leaned in. "And your relationship with Trevor? How would you describe it?" Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly before she answered. "We got along well enough." The reply felt rehearsed, lacking any real emotion. Laura and Samuel exchanged a glance, sensing Eleanor wasn't telling the whole story. As they were preparing to leave, Laura received a call from the forensic team. The torn fabric found at the scene matched a dress often worn by Eleanor. They also detected traces of Eleanor's perfume in the kitchen, confirming the same floral scent they'd noticed earlier. This breakthrough pointed to Eleanor's presence at the crime scene around the time of the murder. With the affair between Trevor and Eleanor now central to the case, the investigation was beginning to unravel deeper truths, and Eleanor was quickly becoming their prime suspect. Detectives Laura Carson and Samuel Ortiz refocused their efforts on the primary suspects Eleanor Bennett, Trevor Myers, and Jasper Connolly. Each had possible motives, and each appeared to be concealing something. Eleanor Bennett became the primary suspect in the case, following key evidence: the torn piece of her dress found near Abigail's body and the distinctive scent of her perfume lingering at the crime scene. Her composed demeanor and evasive responses during the interview further raised suspicions that she was concealing more than just her grief. The detectives began to doubt the simplicity of Eleanor's relationship with Abigail. Meanwhile, Trevor Myers, Abigail's husband, appeared to be overly rehearsed in his grief, focusing more on maintaining appearances than showing genuine sorrow. The detectives investigated Trevor's alibi, discovering inconsistencies. He said he was at work the night Abigail was killed, but his office couldn't verify this. Additionally, his phone records revealed numerous texts to Eleanor leading up to the murder, hinting at a close, potentially illicit relationship between them. Trevor's affair with Eleanor had moved from suspicion to a likely motive for Abigail's murder. If Abigail had found out about their relationship, it would explain why both Trevor and Eleanor might have wanted her gone. The detectives took the possibility of Trevor and Eleanor's motives seriously, noting the extent of deception needed to maintain their affair and the lengths they might go to protect their secret. Jasper Connolly, with his flirtatious behavior towards Abigail and his discovery of her body, also remained a person of interest. When questioned further, Jasper maintained that his concern for Abigail was purely neighborly. However, the detectives were wary of his lack of a solid alibi and the seemingly convenient timing of his presence at the crime scene. Despite this, there was no direct physical evidence connecting him to the murder. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Laura and Samuel were increasingly convinced that Abigail's murder was a crime of passion, fueled by betrayal and desperation. With Eleanor and Trevor having much to gain from Abigail's death, their secret affair provided a compelling motive. Jasper's involvement appeared less likely, but remained a possibility that couldn't be dismissed without further evidence. With the primary suspects identified and their motives clear, the detectives prepared to intensify their questioning. They aimed to uncover a crucial piece of evidence or a revealing confession that would lead them to the truth. The net was tightening around Eleanor and Trevor, and detectives Laura Carson and Samuel Ortiz felt they were on the brink of a breakthrough. The carefully hidden secrets were close to unraveling, and the true story behind Abigail Myers' murder was about to be revealed. The detectives knew they needed one decisive piece of evidence or confession to crack the case wide open. The evidence increasingly pointed toward Eleanor Bennett and Trevor Myers, but the detectives needed either a confession or concrete proof to close the case. Their breakthrough came when the forensic lab reported new findings. A second, smaller piece of fabric from Eleanor's dress, this time with a faint blood stain, was discovered at the crime scene. The blood stain on the fabric matched Abigail's blood type, indicating a confrontation between Abigail and Eleanor on the night of the murder. With this crucial evidence in hand, Laura and Samuel prepared to confront Eleanor once more, certain that the confrontation would reveal more about the true events of that night. During the second round of questioning, Eleanor initially remained calm and denied any role in Abigail's death. However, when Laura presented the fabric with the bloodstain and the lab results, Eleanor's demeanor started to unravel. The once steady veneer of composure gave way to visible signs of distress as the evidence mounted against her. Eleanor's composure began to falter. Her hands shook slightly, and her gaze shifted nervously around the room. Laura, maintaining a steady tone, said, "We know you were at the scene. Eleanor, we found a piece of your dress with Abigail's blood on it." Eleanor's calm facade finally crumbled. Her eyes welled up with tears, and her voice trembled as she began to speak. Yes, it was a struggle. Abigail found out about Trevor and me. She was furious. Things just got out of control. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she broke down, her voice choked with emotion. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she sobbed. "Abigail found out about Trevor and me." Eleanor's voice quivered as she continued. She was furious and said she'd ruin us both. She wasn't herself screaming, attacking me. I didn't know what to do. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt her." Laura and Samuel exchanged a knowing glance, their suspicion now confirmed. This was the confession they needed, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "Trevor," she said, her voice trembling. "Trevor knew she had found out. He was supposed to help me, but when things got out of control, he just left me there. He told me we had to make sure she wouldn't tell anyone." Eleanor continued, her voice barely a whisper. "He said we had to do whatever it took to protect ourselves." The detectives pressed her for more details, but Eleanor's tears turned into silent sobs, and she remained silent, clutching her face in her hands. With Eleanor's confession, the detectives had enough to arrest her. However, Trevor's role was still unclear. Eleanor's statements suggested his involvement in planning the murder, so the detectives decided to bring him in for questioning. Later that day, they arrested Trevor Myers at his office. Trevor, unlike Eleanor, remained steadfast in his denial. He maintained his innocence, refusing to admit any involvement in Abigail's death. However, with Eleanor's confession and the accumulating evidence against him, it was evident to both the detectives and Trevor himself that his version of events was crumbling. The investigation had reached a crucial turning point. Eleanor's confession and Trevor's subsequent arrest were unraveling the truth behind Abigail Myers' tragic death. What began as a secret affair between a mother-in-law and her son-in-law had escalated into a deadly confrontation, leaving both a family devastated and a community in disbelief. The detectives were poised to bring this tragic case to a close. With Eleanor Bennett's emotional confession and the growing evidence against Trevor Myers, detectives Laura Carson and Samuel Ortiz acted swiftly. Both Eleanor and Trevor were formally charged with the murder of Abigail Myers, setting the stage for the legal proceedings to begin. The courtroom was packed on the day of their arraignment, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Eleanor, visibly distressed, entered a guilty plea to manslaughter. She confessed to killing Abigail during a heated confrontation, but her attorney argued that the act had been one of panic, not premeditated murder. The defense portrayed Eleanor as a desperate woman overwhelmed by an impossible situation, claiming she was manipulated by Trevor into believing there was no other option. They painted her as a mother driven to madness by the fear and shame of her affair being revealed. Meanwhile, Trevor maintained his innocence, pleading not guilty and insisting he had no part in Abigail's death. The prosecution presented a strong case, showing how Trevor had manipulated. The defense portrayed Eleanor as a desperate woman trapped in an untenable situation, manipulated by Trevor into thinking there was no other way out. They depicted her as a mother driven to madness by the fear and shame of her affair coming to light. Meanwhile, Trevor maintained, pleading not guilty and insisting he was not involved in Abigail's death. The evidence made it clear to the jury that Trevor bore significant responsibility for pushing Eleanor into her tragic actions. After weeks of intense courtroom drama, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding both Eleanor and Trevor guilty of second-degree murder. Eleanor was sentenced to 15 years in prison, while Trevor received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. For Abigail's friends and family, the verdict offered a measure of closure, but could not erase the deep trauma of her violent death. The community remained in shock as they grappled with the scandal that had shattered a once-respected family. The betrayal and violence that tore through Abigail Meyer's life left the neighborhood reeling, forever altering the perception of a household once held in high regard. Do you have any thoughts about this case, or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Until then, stay safe.